Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karen Tolley, and I am the Robert J. Vlasic Dean of Engineering here at the University of Michigan. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this special fireside chat today, organized as part of the university's Year of Global Engagement and spearheaded by the Office of the Vice President for Engaged Learning. Through this theme year, we as a community are reflecting on the ways education, innovation, and collaboration connect us across borders, and how those connections can shape a more than just a simple working relationship, but rather an inclusive future. We are truly honored today to be joined by Patrick Awuah, a fellow engineer and founder and president of Aseshi University in Ghana. I want to emphasize president and founder. Patrick's story is an inspiring example of what it means to live and lead with a global mindset. Patrick grew up in Ghana and studied in the United States. After a successful career at Microsoft in the US, he returned home to Ghana with a bold vision to create a university that would not only provide academic excellence, but also develop ethical leaders equipped to transform their societies. That's a pretty bold vision. Since its founding in 2002, Aseshi University became a beacon of innovation in higher education, integrating ethics, entrepreneurship, and critical thinking into its curriculum, and building partnerships with institutions around the world. We hope the University of Michigan is one of those. Patrick's journey reminds us that global engagement is not just about crossing borders, but about learning, sharing, and working together to create a meaningful impact. In conversation with President Awuah today is our own Valerio Bertaco, Vice President for Engaged Learning, and the Mary Lou Dorff Professor of Computer Engineering. Together, they will lead us through a discussion on leadership, education, technology, and the future of global engagement. Patrick, we are so grateful to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining this conversation and for sharing your insights with our campus community. And a special thank you for crossing half the planet to be with us and to have brunch with me yesterday.
It's a pleasure.
Please join me in extending a warm Michigan welcome to President Patrick Awuah.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you, Karen, for that wonderful introduction. We are delighted to collaborate with the College of Engineering in organizing this event. And I also would like to thank you for all the support in promoting international engagement for faculty and students in the college. As I really hope you know, this is a year of global engagement for the University of Michigan. We launched in January. It was a presidential initiative aligned with Vision 2034, the strategic plan of the university. And since then, we have launched new faculty-led program to study abroad. Thank you. Scholarship program, Passport Day for our students who never had a passport, and several other activities that you can find on our global.umich.edu website. And so today we are capping our year of global engagement with our marquee speaker, President Awuah. So thank you so much for being here. I also would like to say that very likely, I didn't do anything to achieve that, but during the year of global engagement, we were also named the #1 public university in the US for number of students who study abroad. So I'm not complaining. So I'm thrilled to have you here, Patrick. You may or may not remember that we set up a fireside chat with you and the then Dean of Engineering in 2021 when we organized Africa Week, which was an online virtual event that attracted about 400 participants from the African continent and 400 participants from the US, UMich, and other universities. And that was a fantastic conversation that you had with our Dean of Engineering. And then finally, we got to have you on campus in person. I'm delighted that we were able to coordinate this and to have you here today. So what we would like to discuss today is what perspectives global education bring and augment people's perception of the world and how they can contribute to it. And so I hope that Patrick can guide us from some of those ideas and thought, and maybe can also inspire some of you to do some initiative and activity globally. Can we start with your journey?
Sure.
So you grew up in Canada, then you became a business leader at Microsoft in the US, and then you decided to found a university back home in Ghana. How did that all happen?
Well, so let me first start with a confession.
Okay, really you want to do that in the first 10 minutes? We usually keep them for the 4 p.m. window.
So, when I first came to the United States, I intended to return to Ghana. And then I graduated, I got a job at Microsoft, and a year into Microsoft, I actually went to Ghana for the first time in 5 years since I'd left. And that trip was tough, very difficult. We still had a military government, the telephones didn't work, there were lots of problems. And I returned to Redmond and told all my friends that I've changed my mind, I'll never go back to Ghana to work. So that's my confession, is that there was a moment when I thought I was going to stay in the US, have my career here. I met a wonderful woman, I got married, and I was just, okay, this is what I'm doing. But along the way, the genocide in Rwanda happened. And
After that trip?
After the trip. So this was a couple more years after that. And my wife was pregnant with our first child at the time. He was born shortly after that crisis. And I remember all the really tough news coming out of Africa. There was Rwanda, then there's Somalia, then Liberia, Sierra Leone. And it felt to me that these negative stories coming out of Africa were a problem for the next generation, for future generations of Africans. So I'm looking at this African child when he was born and thinking, the world needs to be different. There's many more people like him coming, and we can't have a planet where Africa is a place of difficulty and despair. And that's really what got me to start thinking about returning to the continent, because it felt like folks like me who had all these opportunities should be back home helping turn things around. It wasn't okay to just stay in Seattle and complain. So that's really where the idea to return came from. The decision to do higher education was based on just a couple of things. One was doing an exercise with friends and family in Ghana about different problems. And if you took a problem and asked why enough times, we settle on the people, the leaders who could make this different were accepting the status quo. And in some cases, these leaders were the cause of the problem. And these were people who had all had a post-secondary education. And so it felt to me that the way, those who have had a post-secondary education, the way they're educated will make a huge difference in the trajectory of our countries and our economies. And the second was, I myself had this really incredible education at Swarthmore College. I went to college having been through an education that was all about rote learning. Just, if you read a piece of literature, the instructor told you if you were lucky, they told you what it meant, and they asked you to repeat back what they told you the book meant. But actually, usually, they would just make you memorize the story and repeat it back to them, right? It's just an example. And then I go to Swarthmore, and it's very different. So there's this education that is really challenging us to think and to be analytical and to connect the dots, right? And I went to study engineering, and they made me do a bunch of other stuff, art history and literature and French and economics and all of this. And I felt that liberal arts education that really pushed critical thinking and problem solving was what empowered me to be, a useful and effective person at Microsoft. And I thought if I could bring that model to Ghana and demonstrate and help change the higher ed system in Ghana, then we would be educating a generation that would be acting differently in the country. So that's where the idea came from.
And that generation of new leaders will solve the problems of Africa and the world problems, right? There are problems outside of Africa too.
I know.
They all have to work.
So the vision statement for Ashesi, right, is really focused in Africa, I must say. It's about, our vision statement is we want to see a continent, an Africa, whose leaders are making decisions, ethical decisions, in the best interests of their citizens. And we want to see an Africa where innovation is driving economic and cultural and social growth. So our mission statement doesn't talk about the university or what we want the university to become. We talk about a cause of what we want the continent to look like. And our role is we're educating the leaders who will make that vision a reality. And I firmly believe that an Africa that is flourishing and that's thriving is good for the world. It's not good only for African citizens, people living in Africa, but it's actually adding a lot of value in the world, and it's something that needs to happen. But we need to be focused on something. So I don't wake up in the morning worrying about higher ed in America.
Okay. I hope you do.
Okay. But I think that the mission we've taken is huge, and it's going to take us a very long time, right? So.
Okay. I'll ask maybe 2 more questions, and then I'll open the mic for questions. So you, at the end of the day, you lived across 2 different continents with very different cultures, very different even professional environment and way to work in a professional setting. What has that done to your way of thinking, to your way of approaching your way of interacting with people and working?
Well, so it's very interesting coming to America because when I was in Ghana, I went to a public boarding school for secondary school. And in this secondary school were kids, boys and girls from all over Ghana. So some from poor rural villages, some from quite affluent families. I lived in a dormitory, and our dorm rooms were like barracks. We had these beds all lined up. And the son of the head of state lived in the same room with me, along with kids from poor parts of Ghana. So I'd seen that kind of diversity, okay? And we considered ourselves as just, we were all Ghanaians. And where you came from was not
a key aspect of this.
It's not a key aspect of anything. Then I come to America. And America was sort of this incredible paradox to me, right? Everything I'd heard about America and read about America was this land of incredible prosperity. And I was absolutely shocked to learn that there were homeless people in America. Like when the first time someone told me there were homeless people, I did not believe it. I just said, this cannot be correct. Until I actually went into inner city Philadelphia to see that. So in America, I experienced for the first time in my life being a member of a minority group. And I experienced for the first time in my life people seeing me as not Patrick, but as a black person. Like, and I know that for a lot of Americans this is kind of strange, but for an African coming here, like the color of my skin is one of many things that describe me. And I didn't think of it as the most important thing that described me, okay? So I had to sort of learn to, like this was like kind of a strange thing, right? The second thing was, I also encountered a lot more diversity in the United States, right? So I got to meet South Africans for the first time, right? I got to meet people from Ethiopia for the first time. I got to meet people from Asia and Latin America, and of course Americans and Europeans. But I got to actually engage with people from many different cultures on this campus at Swarthmore for the first time. And so that was really very interesting. To one of my best friends was someone who had grown up in Romania under communist rule, and listening to his experiences and seeing some of the similarities with when Ghana was a military government, but also like they had a much more severe totalitarian system than we ever had, was really like, wow, the Europeans who've lived in worse than I have seen. How interesting is that, right? And then I go work at Microsoft, and again, lots of diversity there. Working in teams with people from all over, from India, from Africa, from Europe, from the US, all focused on one mission. And I think that perspective I brought back to me to Ghana. And as we were planning Ashesi University, I invited people from my network in the United States to help with curriculum design. We, of course, went to Ghana and understood what the needs were. And I really came to understand that tackling problems with different perspectives got you a better solution than if you were tackling problems with just one perspective.
So I have one more question, then I'll open up for microphone, and there are 2 microphones there at the corner of the rooms. So before Ashesi was an idea, right? You were a kid from Ghana who came to the United States and went to college there. And as you lived in the United States, you start realizing, you start learning about the different perspective and way of interacting that people use here, including the different meaning of being a black person here versus home. When did you realize that that was something special, that you understanding 2 culture could open up doors for you to do things that people who grow up in one country and stay there cannot really imagine, let alone realize? And probably the idea wasn't Ashesi yet, right?
No, it wasn't.
Yeah.
Well, I think again, back in college, I had friends there who, before they met me, didn't know anything about Africa. And then outside of college, like when I went out into Philadelphia, and I would meet like store managers. I once met a store manager that thought Africa was a country in South America. And it was just like, it was really, it was really surprising, right? And I got to speak with her about where I was from. And I think that, you know, when you encounter people from all over the world, you actually learn a lot more about the world. And the world is a very interesting place. And so at Ashesi, we, very early days, decided that we wanted to have internationalization. So we wanted to have students from America come be visiting students at Ashesi. And we were going to recruit students from other countries in Africa. We initially started with just West Africa, so we recruited from Nigeria, Liberia, Sierra Leone. Because I felt that it was important for our students to have the benefit of what I had had at Swarthmore, which is to engage people from outside their own context, right? Because, you know, there's just so much you learn from that. And, you know, I remember, just as an example, when, I should just share with you two examples that I think are kind of important. One that was beneficial to us and one that's beneficial in the US. Our students in 2006 started a debate about whether they were going to have an honor system or not, right?
So 4 years in.
Yeah, 4 years in. And it turns out that we had a visiting student from Princeton University. And Princeton has an honor system. And it was really helpful for our students. They were just really intrigued by this idea. And they were really intrigued by, you know, the described history of how the honor system came about in Princeton like 100 years ago, was that there was so much cheating at Princeton that the faculty went on strike and said, we're fed up, we're not gonna teach anymore. And then the students said, no, we will do better, and we will no longer tolerate cheating, and they got the faculty back in the classroom. So for our students to hear that this thing at Princeton that had lasted over 100 years started out of, you know, a really negative situation was super helpful. Another example was we had a visiting professor from the US who was teaching cryptography, and she had brought a student from her home institution with her to take that course. And at the end of the course, she described to me, she said she was really glad she brought this student with her, because here was this computer science student in a classroom in Africa, and they were sort of learning something quite technical and difficult. And he was amazed because the level of questions that African students were asking was not what he expected. The engagement in the classroom was stronger than what he expected. And there was a time when a student asked a really difficult question that the professor was struggling to answer, and then another student in the classroom answered the question. And she came to me and said it was really important for this student to be in an African classroom and engage with people who are as bright and knowledgeable as he was, and some who were actually stronger than he was in computer science. And what a gift it was for him to return to the United States with, because in his career in the future, the way he would engage with Africa and the stories he would describe to his colleagues here would be different. And I think that's what you get when, you know, people are able to cross borders and engage with each other and see, yes, there are differences, but there's also similarities, and that there's strengths everywhere.
And it helps eliminate stereotypes.
Correct, exactly.
Do
we have questions from the public. There was, go ahead. Hi, Yonju.
I happen to be closest to the mic, so I just
So you
jumped on
won.
it. But I have a question that I'm sure many in the audience share, which is there's a missing piece in the story. It's one thing to say I'm going to go back to the place of my birth and be part of the solution. And the essential way to be part of the solution is through education.
Right.
And then there's actually a building a university from the ground up, which is incredibly, I would imagine, challenging. So I would just love I would love for you to share some significant milestones and some challenges that you encountered in the process of building Asheshi.
All right.
And maybe address what happened to the phones, because clearly they start working at some point.
Right.
From your first trip.
Oh, we had like mobile phones started, and
got
that changed everything. But okay, so the first milestone was the day I asked my wife.
Yeah, that seems like a milestone.
Well, what she would say if I said I was going to quit Microsoft that day and let's go to Ghana and do education we'd been talking about for months. And she immediately said yes, which was not the response I was expecting from a nice Jewish girl who grew up in Seattle, okay? And so I sat up and I asked her, why? Don't you think we should think about this for a little bit?
And she said, you asked the question.
Yeah, she said, sure, let's think about it. And Patrick, take a personal day off. And I asked her, what's a personal day off? She said, well, just take a day off. And so I did for the first time. It was cool. But then it took me, I think, more than a year after she said yes before I walked into my manager's office to say I was leaving. And between the time she said yes and when I decided I was leaving, I asked myself, why am I hesitating? This is clearly important. And interestingly, my job had also started to feel like a chore because it was like, this is just software. There's important things in the world. I decided...
For those of you who are software engineers, it's a good job.
And software is cool, right? but what I'm saying is went from, the magic of software to, Africa needs to be...
I have to debug.
I needed to build a different kind of software. Anyway, so I decided that the reason I was hesitating was I was afraid of failure. And so I needed to manage that fear, and I needed to minimize the chances of failure. So I went to business school. And at Berkeley, I started all the planning for the university. So another milestone was going to Ghana with the team from Berkeley, doing a feasibility study, doing a business plan. There was a milestone where I finished Berkeley, went to Seattle, set up a foundation, put some money in, asked my colleagues to give, and they gave. And then in 2002, we started the university, and that students walked in the gate. And before that, we had our first parent who paid the tuition. And he paid with a check. And what I really wanted to do was frame the check, but we needed the cash, so we cashed. So I cashed it.
You should have made a photocopy.
I know, I didn't think of that. But so students walk in the gate, and that first day, I was walking to greet the students on orientation day, and I saw them coming, and I ran away. I fled. I went to my office to calm myself down because I realized sort of the gravity of what I had just taken on, that these students had put their lives in my hands. And so those were like big milestones, I think, for Ashesi and its making. Challenges, we had the challenge of trying to recruit faculty. The first time we put out job postings, no one from Ghana applied. And I had a couple of volunteers from Microsoft, and one of them is here, Kentaro, oh, there he is, was one of the first 4 faculty at Ashesi. And, you know, so building the team was a challenge, going through accreditation and having accreditation agree to a curriculum that looked very different than the norm in Ghana. But we also went, I think in our second year, our first 2 years, finances were always very tight. In our second year, we almost ran out of cash. I came within 2 weeks of running out of cash. And that was a very, very scary time. We survived that, and it's a long story how we survived that. But getting through that really difficult time was, you know how in America there's a phrase, sweating bullets? I finally understood what that was about. I could feel the pores in my skin, right? And, but we came through that. And there have been just milestone after that, you know, like the honor system that the students did was a big deal. And, you know, the first graduation class was a big deal. But I think the crisis went through in 2004, 2005 that was the most difficult, that was the most scared I've been. I used to come to my office and lie on the floor and put my feet up on my chair just to get some blood into my head, you know. And one of my colleagues, the director of operations, once walked into my office and I was lying there like that. Patrick, what's happening? Are you okay? I said, yeah, I'm fine.
I'm just trying to get through the day.
I'm just trying to get some blood into my head. But yeah, so those were some of the most challenging times.
Question there, and then can you maybe walk towards the microphone so that we can hear your question? Todd, go ahead.
Follow-up. I'd like to ask about the demographics of the students. Are they primarily Ghanaian, or are they international students? And are there graduate students? And then also, what are they primarily studying? What are your big programs? What are the range of programs?
So it's about 75% Ghanaian and 25% non-Ghanaian, and they're from all over sub-Saharan Africa. We don't have students from Northern Africa yet, but Eastern Africa, West Africa, a bit of Central and Southern Africa. And the majors are, we have 5 engineering majors: computer science, business management, economics, law, and public policy. We just started graduate education a couple of years ago, and we have 3 master's programs in mechatronic engineering, an MBA, and then intelligent computing systems.
Okay. Patrick, you started your talk by saying part of the problem is that the leaders in Africa aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. So my question is biased. I'm from political science and I've studied a bit of the political economy of Ghana. How much because when you went back the first time, you said it was military government, but you're going back to Ghana to start this university at a particular critical time when a new president comes in, John Kufuor. How much of that context did it help you actually feel confident that perhaps this could work when there was that peaceful transition?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. By the time I went back to Ghana, or actually by the time I left Microsoft, Ghana had moved from military to an elected government. And the first president was Jerry Rawlings, who used to be a military leader, became a civilian leader. And so, you know, I went to meet with the then Minister of Education and the Deputy Minister for Higher Ed under Rawlings' regime, and got their approval and their support for what I was doing. And in fact, the Deputy Minister for Higher Ed wrote a letter supporting our fundraising campaign in Seattle. So that was great. And then President Kufuor won the elections in 2000, and I was fortunate to be able to meet him. And President Kufuor was very actively encouraging Ghanaians in the diaspora to return home. And he was very actively asking us to come back. I went to meet with him, and he said to me, hey, so what you're about to do is going to be very difficult. And you're going to encounter difficulties because you're a pioneer. And you should make sure it doesn't discourage you. And it was interesting to hear the president say that, because he didn't say, I am going to clear the road for you. I am going to remove the roadblocks. He said, it's great that you're planning to come back. It's going to be tough. But I think it was also useful that he said you should persist. Because when the difficulties came, I remembered what he said. And 5 years into the Ashesi project, we had graduated our first set of students. President Kufuor awarded me a national award, the Order of the Volta, which is one of the highest awards in Ghana, because of what I was doing. So he was very supportive, and I think the important thing about your question is that sometimes I wonder if Ghana was still in a military regime, would I have returned? It would have been tougher. I think even with the same person, the former military regime, now in a constitutional democracy, made it easier for me to return. I felt a little bit more like this is a safer, there's the rule of law, there's a constitution. I'm not going to wake up one day and the government has expropriated what I'm doing and this sort of thing. And so I think this is a really important thing for countries to achieve, is to get to some level of stability, safety, so that progress can be made.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So Ashesi is based on the concept of educating ethical leaders. How do you envision educating global responsible leaders? Is that, you mentioned that you have international students coming to campus, the students go abroad. Is that enough, or is there more conscious type of work that needs to happen so that students, when they graduate, they feel they are global citizens and they can contribute to support the planet, their country or maybe their continent?
I think that it is really important in the world for all educational systems to be engaging students in the question of what kind of world do we want? What do we think a good planet would look like? So it's sort of like these big important philosophical questions. Now, the answers to these questions may not be very interesting, or probably not very interesting if you're debating it with people who are just like you. They're far more interesting and far more illuminating when you're having that conversation with people who are not like you, people who have different perspectives, people who have different lived experiences. Because I would say that we kind of know, like the golden rule, you do to others as you'd have them do to you. You want to have a world, like what you wish for yourself, you should wish for others, right? And the question is and then you also have the question of how do we get there? Again, a far more interesting conversation when you have different perspectives in the room. For us at Ashesi, it has meant that we really want diversity. We want people from different economic strata. We want a balance of men and women. We want people from different religious and political persuasions. We want different nationalities all engaged in this question. And I think that for me, if students who study abroad would take courses that are compelling them to grapple with those kinds of questions, that would be really healthy for humanity. And I think that, that's how we would really have a thriving planet for everyone.
So, you mentioned that you want to train these ethical citizens, and one of the mechanisms is the honor system. What other ways do you have to create these ethical citizens? Is there aspects of the curriculum? What are the tools that you use at Ashesi to ensure that the students who come out are ethical people of integrity and ready to lead?
There are a number of things that we do to do this. So first of all, we have a code of ethics. We have a code of conduct. And we enforce that code, right? So you need to have an environment where people are held to account. And everyone is subject to that code, including the president. So we try to model the behavior that we would like to see. We have a very strict policy. I've never paid a bribe in Ghana. We don't tolerate corruption ourselves. We would rather deal with delays in doing certain things than, get involved in any kinds of corruption. And we really hold people to account. We are very transparent. So I have regular town hall meetings with the students, with staff. They know what's going right, what's going wrong. They get to ask me and my team the tough questions. And we are accountable to them, to the students, to their parents, to each other. The second thing that we've done is we don't have a course called ethics. Actually, the closest we have to a course called ethics is a module in one of our leadership seminars called Giving Voice to Values. And that's, it's based on the work of Mary Gentili, where students are sort of going through cases of ethical dilemmas and they are role-playing how to solve those things. So it's sort of a simulation of real-life cases that they practice so that by the time they graduate, if they encounter this in the real world, they're more likely to do the right thing. But we've sort of put ethics throughout the curriculum, and in particular in a series of leadership seminars that students take throughout their 4 years. And those seminars really focus on, there's one on what constitutes a good leader or a great leader. There's one on what constitutes the governance of a good society. There's one on what constitutes the economic model of a good society. And there's one on servant leadership. And in the servant leadership seminar, they also are required to go do community service. So we're trying to foster empathy and confidence that they get from solving real world problems. And finally, I would say that, we have a set of learning goals for the university. There are 8 of them. And one of them is ethics and civic engagement. And we require all faculty, when they draw up their course syllabi, in addition to the course objectives and how we're going to assess students and all of that, each professor is asked to identify, two, three, or four of the learning goals of the university that the course is going to address and how it's going to address it. So that what happens is students go through a 4-year program where every instructor, regardless of what they're teaching, has put some thought into how to embed the learnings that we ask for in our learning goals, which are really all about character and skills, into their course. And students are sort of engaging in this way and being assessed in that way. And so we've tried to create a very immersive environment around this notion of ethical thinking and ethical behavior. And we celebrate when people do the right thing. There's this very cute thing that we do called Caught Being Good, where students who are doing some really, they're seen doing something good and altruistic. Their colleagues will go tell the dean of students about it, and they're celebrated. And in the same vein, when there's violations of the code and they're adjudicated, the results of that adjudication is public. We take out the names of the individuals, but the scenario is drawn up. The sanctions are, and we put on the website. So
And we could go read.
you could go read all the bad stuff that's been happening. But it's really about learning. Each of those things is a learning moment, is how we sort of think of it. And then I think that when the students came up with the honor system, that came about because we decided that if we were the ones holding the mission of the university, then we were failing if the students didn't own it. And so we went to the student body and the student government and said, what can you do to take ownership of Ashesi's mission? And this was the outcome of that, was what they decided to do as an expression of their ownership of the mission.
Thank you. I think Richard had a question.
Patrick, my friend. I'm Richard Douglas. I'm one of the people in the room who's had the amazing privilege of spending whole semesters teaching and doing research at Ashesi University. I have a different kind of question. All this rationality, all this intellectual stuff, that's all great. But I remember when Ashesi was renting space in an old embassy downtown Accra. I want to know what your emotional response was when you found the hill, the beacon on the hill on which you planted Ashesi University.
Right. So that's a good question. So when we were looking for a site for the university, we tried to be very rational about it.
As one should.
As one should. And my co-founder and I, we had like this rubric. We were looking at, we knew how many acres we wanted. We looked at infrastructure to the site, road access, electricity, telephone access, water. We looked at the risks around land title in the area. We looked at the price of it. We also considered what impact would this university have in a particular location. And we also looked at the ease of doing business in a particular location. And we had assigned weights to all of this, right?
So there would be a single score at the end.
Yes, so there would be a single score, and that's how to make that. There was one about also the physical beauty of the site. And so we evaluated 6 sites, and so we fell in love with this one for 2 reasons. One was the chief and the elders of Brekusu were very warm to us. And when I say very warm to us, the protocol in the chief's court was we speak through a linguist. So he would speak Chi, his linguist would interpret, would translate it to in Chi to me, and I would translate it in English to Nina, who's my co-founder. And this went back and forth for a while, and the chief said, for the sake of this American woman, we speak English. And he started to speak English. and just the fact that he was so thoughtful and gracious towards Nina was very touching to us. And he also insisted that the youth of the village were present in the conversation, because the way he put it was, this is about the youth, and so they must be present. It can't just be the elders making the decision. So there was that. And then there was just the sheer physical beauty of this hill overlooking Accra. It was green, very beautiful views, 360-degree views. And so anyway, we did our rubric, and Brekusu came in second. And so we went and changed the weights.
That's what an engineer does.
So we realized that the physical beauty and the ease of doing business was higher in our priority. So we changed the weights, and then it became number one. And then we went along with that site.
Fantastic. So you launched a lot of partnership between Asheshi and other international universities. Yeah. What makes a partnership really impactful and equitable? What do you look for in selecting a partner?
Well, I think that the best partnerships are the ones where there's a real win-win situation, right? So there's something that we get out of it, and there's something that the partner gets out of it. And, we know what we're going to get out of it. We don't always know what the partner is going to get out of it, and vice versa. And I think that it's really important, or what they want out of it. And it's really important when you're having the conversation to ask each other, what is it that you want out of it? So, when a partner doesn't ask us, what is it that we're hoping to get out of it? That's usually
a red flag.
Or if we've expressed something that we're trying to get out of it, and then there's a conversation that does not address that at all, that's a more serious flag, right? And so, but I think it's really important for both sides to ask the question. And we have really pressing needs, right? So, and I've described some of it. I actually really want Ashesi students to be exposed to people from all over the world, from all over the continent. We have benefited incredibly from having Zimbabwean students and Kenyan students in our classrooms in Ghana. Our students have really benefited, and those students have benefited as well. But we also have needs such as, when we went to Swarthmore and Berkeley and University of Washington to have faculty work with us on curriculum design, or when their faculty worked with us on screening applicants, or when their faculty came and co-taught with us. These were all really helpful in building our capacity at the university, and we're not bashful about saying this is a need that we have. And it was really great that they were willing to share with us in this way. That their knowledge and their abilities and their capabilities sharing with us. We have now a really incredible partnership with ETH Zurich that helped us set up our first master's program in mechatronic engineering. And in that partnership, they're helping us stand up an important program. They send a lot of faculty. They have limits to what they can do. They cannot send a professor to come be with us for 4 months at a time. And so they needed for us to co-design something that would work for them. And we came up with a design where faculty can come from Zurich for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, co-teaching with our faculty. And, we provide housing and all of that. But it also enabled them to build stronger connections with Swiss companies that are operating in Africa. They're engaged with our students in ways that they find interesting for themselves. So they're getting something out of it, and we're getting a lot out of it.
The student go to Zurich? Is that also, what's their win?
So I think that a win for ETH Zurich is, frankly, the relationships that they have with philanthropists that are funding this program through ETH Zurich. So funding is going to them and coming and supporting us. So there's a connection that they're getting with industry and a partnership that they're getting with industry that is very useful to them. They've also expressed to us that when their faculty come to Ashesi, they really gain a lot from being in a classroom. They say that our students are more engaged and hungrier than their own students. And so they sort of get energized by that. They really truly seem to get a lot of personal and professional satisfaction from engaging with our students in this way, which is another win for them. And they're so pleased with this program that they're now talking with other African universities and talking with other Swiss universities about coming up with this sort of end-to-end partnership where they're helping to build capabilities in Africa. And Switzerland is, I think, Ghana's biggest trading partner. So there's that relationship with Switzerland between Ghana and Switzerland, which so they want to engage with.
I had a question about equitable partnerships, and so that was stolen by Valeria. So I'm going to go in a different direction and ask you, you talked about the milestones of forming your university, but what were some of the moments that you wish you could do over?
I love that you have to think about it.
This is a very difficult question. And the reason it's a very difficult question is the answer has varied over time based on where we were. So if you had asked me this question, let's say 5 years into Ashesi, I would have said, I would not have started Ashesi without having all the funding I needed for the first
Graduating class.
5-6 years. Those startup years were just incredibly stressful and very difficult. But you fast forward a few years from that, and my answer has changed, because I feel like if we hadn't started, we might never have started. We might never have got through to where we are today. And I'm glad that we took that risk. And as dangerous as it was, and as difficult as it was, in long-term hindsight, it was probably a good thing to do. There have been some other, I think that your question has also to do with questions about regret, right? And my biggest regrets have been around when we've made hiring decisions that were bad hiring decisions. Like when people on the team have really caused disruption. Those have been tough. I feel like huge waste of time. But again, in the moment I feel that way. But after the fact, I feel like, well, some of that is, first of all, it's inevitable. Not everything will work out. And second of all, these are great learning moments. And you learn from it and you move on. And things get better. So there is something that I am desperately working on to have it not be a regret in the future. Which is that, I have an expiration date. There will come a time when I will retire or I will die. Or let's just say there's come a time I will not be there anymore. And we need to be doing things now to make sure that when that day comes, the university will not only thrive, actually it'll do better than even when I was there. And so thinking about succession, thinking about like very deep sustainability, this is something that I am very actively engaging with and trying to get this thing to a place where the future will be very strong.
I have a question about technology.
About technology.
I mean, technology is a big part of what Asheshi has to offer, right? So I guess it has two parts that maybe not necessarily flow into each other. But on one end, how can technology be a vehicle to co-innovate, to collaborate, to be stronger partner with universities that are in Africa and so really far away, right? And on the other hand, it's a little bit something we are struggling a lot with, which is, the University of Michigan has strong technology innovation component and a lot of effort. And being a university, we think about exchanging ideas with whoever want to hear us. And now we find ourselves in a world where I can share with you, but I cannot share with her. And today I can share also with him, but not tomorrow. We keep having to navigate all these complications that as professor innovators, we really want nothing to do with. Do you have any advice on that second part?
Well, I think your question has to do with how it's getting harder for people to cross borders. Is that it?
Yes, I was trying to not be so direct about that.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I understand the question. So, we once had a course with a university.
Sorry, yes, cross-border, but also ideas crossing borders, right? I mean, it's the people with idea in their head.
Yes.
Okay.
So we once had a course with a university in Canada, which was a joint course. So it was the same material, and there was a video conference between two classrooms, and debates and conversations between students in Canada, in Toronto, in Waterloo, and in Brekuso, in Ghana. Now, humans didn't cross borders for that, but ideas cross borders enabled by technology. And I think that we may need to do more of that. I probably need to do more of that. We need to sort of figure out how do we reach out, even when it's hard for people to get visas to travel and so on. We're still speaking with each other. We're still engaging with each other. And I think that's like one of the obvious uses of current technology. I also think that there are, for us in Ghana, there was a time that Ashesi University ran a lot of its systems on its own servers. We were running, we had server rooms and running all our critical data stored locally. And now it's all in the cloud. And the reason we actually made the decision to move into the cloud, and we moved into the cloud faster than some universities in this side of the world, was simply because electricity was not reliable enough in Ghana. So the grid was not reliable. And we had all these systems, and we still do. We have UPSs, we have voltage regulators, we have emergency generators to step in when the grid fails. But it got to a point where it's like, wow, if we lose this data, we have a big problem. And we're doing backups and all of that, but it's still risky. So it's better to put it in the cloud and still do the and do the backups in the cloud as well, and also have some local copies. And it's made our lives so much simpler. And when COVID hit, we were able to just transition online, and almost all departments, there was one department that still had to come to campus, which was our accounting department, because they had refused to move our accounts into the cloud. And they had stuff sitting locally on site. Well, as soon as they could, they moved things back into the cloud, and with all the security protocols and so on. But I think technology enables us now to operate in certain ways that we couldn't in the past.
So was the pandemic an opportunity to have more classes that were offered across two different institutions and put together people from the two institutions? Or that was a one time, or how?
It was. So during the pandemic, we had a lot more electives because our students were taking courses with American universities. It's online. Doesn't matter whether it's happening in New York or coming out of Accra, right? So now, the interesting thing about, and this is sort of, students really wanted to be back on campus after the pandemic, and they actually prefer in-person classes certainly at the undergrad level. Our graduate programs, one of them is doing more hybrid, the MBA, and we're going to see how that goes. But I think that technology enables us to sort of have a blended approach, which is helpful. And today we still have some courses that are online being taught by foreign faculty.
Who don't come to campus?
Who don't come to campus, and our students are on campus, but they take those courses online.
Questions? Yes, go ahead.
I kind of have two questions in one. So you had mentioned a feasibility study when you first started it. And I guess my first question is, to what extent was that feasibility study accurate, especially in the context of Ghana at that time? And also, I know that Ashesi teaches people how to think, and they teach people how to innovate and, kind of build structures. So how also how is it ingrained in the curriculum to teach students to adjust to the context of Ghana or any other developing economies? And even like for us in the diaspora who maybe want to come back home and set up something, how should we also take that into accountability?
All right, so interesting questions. So the feasibility study that we did measured two things broadly, right? So we try to measure what was the demand? Like, what were the, first of all, what were the gaps in higher education from the perspective of business leaders, public sector leaders, civil society leaders, and even the military? What were the gaps they were seeing from students of Ghana's universities? We wanted to understand what were the ambitions of high school students and what did they want to study, and we wanted to get a lay of the land in terms of what majors were most desirable. And we also wanted to understand what the demand was in terms of what people were willing and able to pay for higher education. And so we gathered a lot of data on that. It was focus groups, we did thousands of surveys, and we had all this sort of demand side information. The second was supply side. So understanding what is the likely cost structure to deliver what we had heard was needed. What was how much did we have to pay faculty to get good faculty? What was it going to cost for electricity and rent and all of those things? And then it was just a very simple analysis of, given the two curves, the demand curve and the supply curve, would this thing be economically viable, right? So we wanted to understand what is desired, what can we actually do, what's feasible, and what is economically viable. And so that's what the feasibility study was. And the data we got was that we understood exactly what was needed, and it was very interesting because when we were talking with people in industry and so on about what they wanted to see, a lot of it was, they wanted critical thinkers, they wanted people who could be creative, who could deal with ambiguity, who could ask the right questions, all of those things that we think of as, that the liberal arts does so well. And they wanted people with certain hard skills, disciplinary skills. And so we were going to do both. And we said, okay, this thing is economically viable. We think it's feasible from the perspective of being able to hire faculty. We know how we're going to operate. And we did a business plan, and we entered this business plan into a business plan competition at UC Berkeley. And this plan was being reviewed by venture capitalists. And the consistent feedback we got from all these finance guys was, this is a very strong business plan, but it has one part of it which is not feasible, which is getting funding. Because, and we had said our funding model is, we're going to be nonprofit, we're going to look for philanthropic money. But at the time, the world was focused on the Millennium Development Goals. It was all about primary education, not higher education. There weren't a lot of foundations or others doing anything with higher education in Africa. And they said, you're just not going to be able to raise the money, so this is not going to work. And I said, oh, they're wrong. Of course I'm going to be able to raise the money. This is obviously it should be self-evident that this is important. And I'm quite sure that a bunch of philanthropists, and I knew some Microsoft people were going to support it. And so we got started anyway. And as I said, 2 years in, I was asking, man, maybe those guys were right. Maybe this thing is not fundable, and it was super scary, but we got through that as well. But so the plan, and we actually went according to plan, except for our break-even point was later than we initially anticipated. And fundraising was harder than we thought it was going to be. But we had a plan to get to a population of 400 students. It would require a fundraise of $15 million to get us to a campus build and all of that. And we actually we're almost exactly on target. I mean, it was $14.5 million to get to our campus at the time with 500 students, so more than the 400 we had planned. And 2.5 million of that was debt, so not 14.5 million in all grants. But it was quite remarkable how close we went to plan because we were sort of tracking so closely. Now, in terms of teaching people how to innovate in Ghana's context, so in some ways, we obviously want them to do that. So we want them to, like when you're planning a business or an idea, you really want to look at, is it viable in this context, right? And so you need to sort of have a deep empathy for the customers that you're trying to reach, or the beneficiaries of whatever services that you're trying to deliver. And that is a lot about being able to do the research and understand what it is that you're trying to deliver. But there's a part of what we're trying to do where we want people to disrupt and not be too bound by the perceived sort of box or parameters, right? You do want someone to sort of push beyond the current performance horizon. And that's a challenge, right? So one of the challenges we're trying to do right now with our Center for Entrepreneurship is, a lot of our students and alumni come out with business ideas, which are really small businesses. And they're afraid of thinking about a business that's going to scale because everything that they've seen is that there's all these sort of boundaries of what you can do. And we actually want them to sort of break beyond that. And so we do want them to sometimes challenge, maybe I shouldn't say challenge, question the status quo. We want them always to question the status quo and have the courage to sometimes say, we can go beyond what the status quo seems to be.
So we have 10 minutes. There are 3 questions, plus I have one. So we want to give it about 2 minutes each. Okay, go ahead.
As you have hinted at a couple of times, Aseshi is not the first university in Ghana.
Right.
The oldest ones were established still during the colonial period.
Right.
And so I was wondering, how would you define the difference of Aseshi?
All right, so the biggest difference of Ashesi from what we call the traditional universities is that our model of education sort of completely moves away from the notion of rote memorization of information to really trying to empower people to be analytical and to be problem solvers. I would say that this is probably the biggest thing. The second thing is, the traditional universities are all government run. And one of the things that I used to do actually before Ashesi started, I would go for these walks on the campus of the University of Ghana. And for those of you who've been to the campus of the University of Ghana, it's a beautiful campus, and the architecture is just incredible. And I spoke with one of the first professors there, a gentleman who lived in Sussex. I went to Sussex to talk with him about, when they were starting the University of Ghana with professors from England, what were they trying to accomplish? And he said, we were trying to build Oxbridge. And if you look at the architecture of the University of Ghana, you see the vision that was there. And you see that they had a lot of funding. And things changed when their economic engine stumbled when government funding for universities declined in the 70s and 80s. And I think the culture also changed a little bit. And so one of the things that we do at Ashesi is I pay a lot of attention to the economic engine. We run it on business principles. And I'm a real stickler for that. And we also pay a lot of attention to be very intentional about the culture we're building on the campus and building systems to sort of support that culture. So for example, performance evaluation at Ashesi does not only measure what you were supposed to do, it also measures how you did it, right? The how you did it has to do with the decisions and actions that you took. So there's what you said you were going to do in this year, and there's a 360 evaluation that's measuring you in Ashesi's core values of scholarship, leadership, and citizenship. And this is your colleagues, your supervisor, your subordinates, measuring you on, did you exhibit being a teacher and a student? That's scholarship. Did you exhibit helping others to be more successful? That's leadership. Did you exhibit social consciousness, ethics, and all of those things? And so we've tried to build a system that's going to try and manage the culture to be very aligned with the core values of the institution. And I think that sort of business management approach that we have is also a difference with the other universities currently.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Building on that question about the other universities in Ghana, taking a page out of the health sector, we often see, Cath and Korle-Bu and Tamale Teaching Hospital seen as sort of too big and too overwhelming, too inefficient. Let's just build our own. We'll just build our own private hospital. And it's much more efficient, but there's a trade-off in terms of availability, accessibility, and affordability. How is that analogy appropriate or not to Ashesi?
It is very appropriate to Ashesi. And by the way, one of the things I did when we were doing the feasibility study was I asked professors at the 3 big universities, I asked for their personal advice to me. Should I be trying to set up a new university, or should I come join one of their universities? And they all said, set up a new university. It was very interesting to hear them say that. And
create competition, please.
Basically, yes. They said, they kept talking about the system is very difficult to change here, and you would be doing our country a service by setting up. And by the way, the people, it was not a good sample. I spoke with people who had returned from the United States. Okay. So there was a sampling bias there, but intentionally I wanted to understand. So the way I see our project is ultimately our success is going to be about critical mass. And the challenge that confronts us all is a huge one. So Africa's population is going to grow by another 1 billion people in the next 30 years or so. Actually, in the next 25 years. And we need to scale to the size of the problem. And no one institution, public or private, can scale to the size of the problem. So it has to be a systemic effort. And I think that what is really helpful is you have multiple actors, you see what's working, and you try and replicate what's working in other places. And you have these multiple actors collaborating and supporting each other. And so that's sort of the model that I have in my mind. It's partly competition, and it's partly collaboration. And I do think that this is something that is true everywhere. Like even in the industry I used to work in, in technology, we all have this performance horizon of what we can do, let's say in ease of use of computers. And then Apple, and everybody's sort of nudging against this thing. And then Steve Jobs and Apple just blow a hole through it. They just, the Macintosh ships, and suddenly it's very different horizon that everybody sees. And then all the other systems start to get easier to use, right? And that's a competitive dynamic that occurs. And I think but that competitive dynamic causes a critical mass and a going beyond the horizon. And so I think that you need to do all of that. KNUST, University of Ghana, when we started, their computer science departments didn't have very many functioning computers. And by the way, I'm very serious about this. There was a time when professors from Legon, University of Ghana, came to visit Ashesi, and we had this computer lab. It wasn't that many, it was 20 computers, but they were state of the art. And they looked at each other, and I heard them say to each other, we must have something like this. And I was really pleased to hear that okay, here's a small university that has done this. We can too. And so they go off and do it, right? And now we're in a place where we started a bioengineering program. We started with a bioengineering course. We didn't have a lab. And the University of Ghana's Noguchi Institute allowed our students and faculty to come use their labs. And we benefited from that. And then we got some donor funding and we built our own lab. And I think that kind of collaboration is also a very powerful way to strengthen the whole system.
I think we are running out of time, so maybe I can ask Caleb to ask the question when we close. I need to ask you one very quick last question. We talked about how Ashesi is really committed to educating global leaders, how we create international collaborations. Beautiful. But then we open the door, and many countries are limiting visas, nationalism tendencies. Like, how are we going to navigate the reality of what's outside? And I know the United States is a big part of the problem, but it's not the only problem. How do we continue to foster these goals of educating global leaders, given the reality on the ground? I'm sure you've been thinking about it because you think about everything.
I don't think about everything, but I do have an answer to that, and which is that if you look at many natural systems, there's a wave that happens. Everything is a cycle. Like, the sun comes up and it goes down, the moon comes up and it goes down, we wake up, we sleep. Like, there's just this notion of cycles is all around us. And I see some of this stuff as that yes, now there's sort of a closing and moving to more nationalistic sort of thinking rather than global thinking. But I don't think it's going to stay. I think it's going to be a wave as well. And I also think that what is happening now is actually we're going to get information and learnings from it that we should be using to teach, right? So, a town hall meeting we had last semester was just having a conversation about the closure of USAID and the Ashesi community having a discussion about that. I don't know if this happened in universities here. Did people sit down and talk about? But I think that all of these things that happen are, present data and information for the learning process that students are going through. And we should treat it as that. And based on what we learn from that, there will be a different cycle that will emerge. And as I've said, I think that in any case, moving warm breathing bodies around is not the only way to
Connect.
And so we should be connecting anyway through digital means.
Thank you. So, thank you so much, Patrick Awuah, for being with us today. It's really appreciated. I would also like to thank Karen Tolley for the introduction. I would really like to thank all the organizers who put this incredible event together, Amy Curry, Eileen Hash, and Cindy, who's probably preparing the next step of this, and all of you public for being here. So, a round of applause, and thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
I hope you come back soon.